We did some research into how consistent are elite running backs every year, and what we did is we filtered by the top 24 running backs on a points per game basis and looked at each week they finished as a running back 1, running back 2, or running back 3. And then we looked at when they did not have a touchdown in those games, how many weeks of those were they complete duds, meaning they were complete eggs, less than 5 points, or they're not finishing in the top 36 that week. And it told us a lot about not only the running back consistency year over year in terms of the tiers that they fall in and how they perform over the long term, but how we should be approaching our fantasy drafts this year and who we should be targeting and maybe avoiding based on current touchdown projections. So do us a huge favor before we start, drop a like on this video. If you haven't subscribed, make sure you do, because as you can see from this little graphic right here, a ton of you watching haven't subscribed. And we, Nathan and I, work pretty hard, and we would love to have your subscription. It means a lot to us. It's really easy. So if you would just please subscribe. It takes 2 seconds and it's very helpful. We can bring you more research like this if you do. But let's go ahead and look at this. And I headed up the research for the video. Ryan Bredd did the research for the running back dud, so shout out Ryan. And then you've kind of looked at this through like your own new lens after looking at what I wrote down here. So let's just go ahead and categorize this into 3 tiers based on the dud percentage. And again, the dud percentage is the weeks where these running backs were not a running back 1, running back 2, and running back 3. And again, these were the top 24 running backs on a points per game basis. So these should be the best running backs in the league at that time for that specific season. We have 3 years of data here we're working with, 2021, 2022, and 2023. And what I found is there are really 3 tiers for dud percentage here the last couple of years. 0 to 10%, meaning you had 0 to 10% dud weeks. That's elite consistency. That's 1 to 0 games that you were not a running back 3, right? Okay. 10 to 25%. That means you were fairly consistent. It means you have good consistency there, right? A dud percentage of 10%. That's 2 to 3 games that you are laying an egg, and the rest of the games you are a running back 36 or higher, right? And you would expect that out of the guys who are top 24 in points per game. But you'd be surprised. A lot of these elite running backs lay more goose eggs in these games than you think, and it makes a huge difference. And then the top tier, fairly inconsistent, is 25% or more. And as you'll see, the trends on that have changed year over year. Let's start with 2021 and let's look at that, and I'll let you kind of talk through what you see through in 2021 and especially how it kind of goes down each year in terms of the dud percentage. So
when you're looking at 2021, you're seeing right at the top here, right? Damian Harris has the highest dud percentage of any of those guys in 2021. You remember that was a year that he had a running back 1 season. And when you're looking back at his statistics and his efficiency metrics, you're like, holy crap, this is literally from his goal line carries. Like that is how he was a running back 1. And we'll see if that happens again in a New England offense. Lo and behold, it didn't, because that's not how the Patriots ran their offenses for the last 25 years. But it's interesting to note that he's on there. Cordarrelle Patterson, the second highest guy there as well. If you remember his 2021 huge breakout season at 30 years old, and he has a 44% dud percentage, 56% total touchdown dependency when he had those running back 1 weeks. And then it kind of goes down the list and into those ranges that are kind of mediocre, right? CMC, Dalvin Cook, Nick Chubb, DeAndre Swift, in that range. There's not really a bunch that you can pull from that metric there. But then you move on to 2022, right? And then you're like, okay, are there any similarities to Damian Harris? Well, right at the top, Miles Sanders. What ended up happening to Miles Sanders in 2023? Bad. Nothing. That was a huge L with us. We thought he was going to be very effective as a fantasy asset in Carolina.
Which if we had known about this, it would have given us at least somewhat of a clue that this was going to happen.
Yes, exactly. And JT actually was up top there. He had a really, really poor season. The Colts had a terrible season as a whole. You kind of expected a little bit of regression. Some people did, not everyone, because he was going as one of the most valuable assets in fantasy in 2022. 101, 102. Yeah. And he ended up losing a lot of his touchdowns, struggled with injury. Zeke Elliott, I think, is another guy that's very noticeable up top, right? 30% dud, 90% touchdown dependency. And this was just kind of a downward trajectory for Zeke Elliott, which is why a lot of people expected Tony Pollard to be productive in 2023. He ended up not necessarily, but in 2023, Derrick Henry is the biggest name here. And I think this is the one that we want to talk about quite a bit in this video is how do we deal with Derrick Henry in 2024? Because let's be honest, for the last 5 years, people have been projecting regression for Derrick Henry and it hasn't come.
Yeah, let's look specifically, if we could have this side by side, 2022 and 2023, and let's see how this can be used to predict regression. Miles Sanders was the top at 2022, regressed. Jonathan Taylor, he only played 10 games this year, and he didn't regress, but he's one of the better running backs in the league, so he's a little bit of an outlier. DeAndre Swift, year over year, different situation, so he did get a little bit better, but only played in 7 games. Ezekiel Elliott regressed. Alvin Kamara didn't, but he has receiving upside. Tony Pollard regressed. Ramondre Stevenson regressed. Josh Jacob regressed. Dameon Pierce regressed. And so you'll see a lot of these top guys here with the dud percentages over 15%. When you look at the year over year stuff, they're regressing a little bit. Okay, so let's look at 2023, and then let's kind of identify here who we should be identifying as regression candidates and who are the guys where we think, okay, maybe there's an exception here, like the Jonathan Taylors the year before, like the Alvin Kamaras. And let's talk about Derrick Henry.
Here's the number one thing that you should be able to easily pull away from this data. If they have a high dud rate and a high touchdown dependency, then you should, in theory, be avoiding them this year.
Because you saw that with Jonathan Taylor. The one thing he had going for him year over year was the touchdown dependency when he was bad in 2022 was only 57%.
Right.
And then you had Alvin Kamara, 18%, right? So let's look at this combination of these two statistics for last year, and let's identify some guys we think that could maybe regress this year. Let's start at the top. Derrick Henry has a pretty high dud percentage, the highest of the... Now, you will notice... 2021, 2022, you had a lot of guys over 25%. In 2023, you don't have any guys. So duds have actually, last year, duds were a lot less common among running backs than they had been in previous years. So that's something to note. Running backs across the board have been a little bit more consistent, which you've seen that. As you've seen the distribution of running back points in fantasy football be a little bit more even across more committee backfields. And then also running backs get more receiving usage, right? I mean, that's going to raise their floor a little bit, and that's going to lead to less dud percentages. But let's look at here. Derrick Henry. Now, here's the thing. He played in 16 games. His dud percentage was 25%. So you do the math there. He had 4 dud games, right? In all of those dud games, he didn't score touchdowns. And so what you'll notice there is Derrick Henry, when he did not score a touchdown, was pretty much laying an egg for your fantasy football team last year. And that's concerning because this year Derrick Henry is going still in the 3rd round of fantasy football drafts. And you'll also see that his touchdown dependency last year was not insignificant. 75% is a pretty big number. Now, I will say this. When you're looking at underdogs projections for touchdowns this year, Derrick Henry is projected 2nd most touchdowns in the league if you use the over-under as the median range of outcomes for touchdowns, which whether you want to or not, we have these all listed out here on basically highest to lowest, what you can place bets on an underdog right now. Henry is at 10.5 to CMC's 11.5, and that's 2nd highest. And so what should you know about Henry? Henry's not a bad pick because even though Derrick Henry last year, he was 17th in points per game, which was a pretty good regression from the year before when you're looking at he was 4th in points per game in 2022 and he was 1st in points per game in 2021, right? And so it's not like it's no secret that Derrick Henry is regressing. So not only is he becoming less of, a high points per game scorer, he's also becoming less consistent. And so you've seen, even though Derrick Henry has continued to be a relevant fantasy asset, you've seen him continue to regress in his efficiency metrics and in his overall performance, right?
Now, what's the glaring change from the past couple years, Derrick Henry, to Derrick Henry this year?
Derrick Henry's on a new team.
On a new team that is twice the team that the Titans are.
Correct.
Sorry, maybe that's controversial because the Titans have beaten the Ravens in the playoffs before. But
that's true. But
they do seem to be quite a bit more effective in the way that they could utilize a guy like Derrick Henry at this point in his career as opposed to the Titans. Just when you saw the regression last year in Tennessee, and a lot of that is because of Lamar Jackson, right? In theory, with a rushing QB like Lamar Jackson, that's going to open the field up for Derrick Henry to be a little bit more effective, even though he's aging, because now they have to focus on 2 guys, right? Defensively, They have to focus on 2 guys as opposed to just Derrick Henry every single year in Tennessee.
Exactly. So let's look at this. Derrick Henry, what does this tell you about Derrick Henry this year? Derrick Henry is probably going to be extremely boom or bust. Most likely. Because you didn't really expect, even before this video, you're not really going into Derrick Henry's analysis and saying this guy's going to catch a lot of balls and have a lot of receiving touchdowns. His over-under for receiving touchdowns is normally set at 0.5. So the dude is rarely getting that type of work, and therefore his floor is 0 to 3 points. Legitimately, it is. And honestly, for Derrick Henry this year, I don't think Derrick Henry is a bad pick, but I think he's a better pick in best ball than he is your regular fantasy football redraft leagues for this reason. Derrick Henry, on the weeks where he's not going to score touchdowns for the Ravens, which is possible because you now are playing in Tennessee. At least he was playing with a quarterback that wasn't going to vulture those rushing touchdowns. Now he is playing with a quarterback that will take us at least a little bit of those. And whether or not, I mean, Lamar kind of goes back and forth between how many rushing touchdowns he has each season. Maybe this is a year where Lamar has a ton of them. Maybe it's a year where he doesn't have a lot and they give the ball to Derrick Henry. You saw Gus Edwards in this exact offense last year was a running back 2 and relevant just because of his touchdowns. Literally just because of his touchdowns. And I think Derrick Henry is going to be in a similar production role this year and probably in a similar production range. I think obviously Derrick Henry has a little bit more upside than Gus Edwards because he is still, number one, twice the player that Gus Edwards is. But number 2, he does have upside on the ground outside of just scoring touchdowns, where Gus Edwards, there wasn't a ton there. That being said, Derrick Henry, you are going to have to be careful drafting him this year because, again, he is going to be inconsistent. You never know when he's going to lose you a week or 2 or 3, or in this case, 4 weeks. The good news with Derrick Henry is, like I said, while last year you were having to grab Derrick Henry in the 2nd round, this year you're getting him in the 3rd or 4th round, right? It's just going to depend on where you're drafting, but his price is better. But he is definitely a regression candidate. The next guy that you see here with really, again, they're all going to be in this 10 to 25% tier because there weren't any players last year above 25%. I'll let you talk about this. The next guy you see here with a pretty high total dependency is Devon Achane. 86% with a 13% dud percentage rate.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we're going to want to monitor in 24, and why someone, I think in our most recent video about running backs, asked us, like, hey, in the first 2 rounds when you were mentioning your favorite running backs to draft, why did you not mention Devon Achane? This is the reason why. It doesn't mean that we don't think Achane can't be successful in a Mike McDaniel offense. I mean, you just saw him be the most efficient running back that we've ever seen in the history of the NFL with his limited volume, granted, but This is why the touchdown dependence is really, really high, and the dud percentage is for the amount of times that he was on the field. It still is like it's notable. It's nothing crazy. It's just kind of mediocre, but you can see guys like that still sustain solid production, just not at the level that someone that you might be expecting with Devon Achane. For example, 2022 Jamal Williams, 0% dud rate with 78% touchdown dependence, right? Because he was getting all the red zone carries over DeAndre Swift. Look at the same offense, David Montgomery. They basically moved on from Jamal Williams, went to David Montgomery. David Montgomery, 88% touchdown dependent, 0% dud percentage when he was on the field. So even Raheem Mostert, 0% and 83% touchdown dependence. So to me, you're looking at the same touchdown dependence between like Devon Achane, Raheem Mostert, and David Montgomery. And understandably, Achane is going much, much higher than those other guys because his ceiling is, in theory, a lot higher because of his talent level. But to me, I understand why people would pass on a guy like Achane super high and then just take the guys that are just as touchdown dependent at a much cheaper price when they're in situations where you know they're going to get opportunities to score touchdowns consistently on a weekly basis and probably be pretty safe and finish as wide or as running back 2s on the year.
Yeah. And so here's what let's put this into practical terms now, because again, a couple stats for you by tier here. For the elite consistency guys, so this is again the guys from tier 0 and 10%, they on average had 7.5 games with a touchdown per year, and their average touchdown dependency rate was 61%. The good consistency tier averaged 7.2 games with a touchdown each year, and their touchdown dependency rate was an average of 60%. And then the inconsistent tier, the 25% or more, 5.5 games with touchdowns a year, and the average touchdown dependency rate there was 65%. So you'll notice a couple things here. Number one, the most consistent running backs score the most touchdowns, period. And you see that. I mean, when you go down and even look at last year, McCaffrey had 13 games with a touchdown. Joe Mixon had 10. Raheem Mostert had 10. Kyron Williams had 9. Brian Robinson had 8. I mean, Brian Robinson, man, you really wouldn't think of Brian Robinson as like super duper consistent, right? He didn't have any dud weeks last year in 12 games. Joe Mixon is the definition of a consistent running back. He really is. And again, you can have guys higher up here that you're less worried about because their dependency is so low. Guys like Travis Etienne. Travis Etienne does have receiving upside, so you're going to be less worried about him, even though he's got a 57% dependency rate. Breece Hall, really high receiving upside, right? So again, the most inconsistent running backs, and I want to make, are more reliant on their touchdowns to score their points and to get their running back 1, 2, or 3 finishes. And so this is, even though Derrick Henry was one of the best running backs in the league, he was one of the most inconsistent running backs statistically. And the reason was because he needed touchdowns to produce as a running back 1, 2, or 3. And the same thing really goes for any of the guys you can analyze from the last couple of years. Miles Sanders was like that. Ezekiel Elliott was like that. Damian Harris was like that. Cordell Patterson was like that. And, looking here in the really good tier, the guys with really, really high touchdown dependency that were really consistent, most of the time, those guys fall into only two camps. Number one, they're a really, really elite running back, or number two, they are a guy who scored a ton of touchdowns and they're due for serious regression. Here are examples of both. Jonathan Taylor, 80%, Austin Eckler, 80% in 2021. They both had good 2022 years, right? Well, Jonathan Taylor was worse, but Eckler was really good, right? You weren't worried about their fantasy value necessarily when you were drafting them.
Right.
When you're looking at the next year in that tier, the only guy that had there were two guys here that had really, really high touchdown dependency rates. Christian McCaffrey, elite, and then Jamal Williams. And Jamal Williams is a perfect example of somebody who was a veteran that got a lot of touchdowns the year before that regressed and became, what he was.
Again, it was because he left that situation. But when you saw that situation filled by Montgomery, you saw the exact same production.
Exactly.
So it was more the situation than the actual player.
And David Montgomery was 88% last year touchdown total dependency, which is very, very high. But
again, he
had no duds.
You would expect that to stay pretty consistent. Like if you see a technically high touchdown dependency rate, but they have 0% duds, you're literally looking at all of the elite running backs, plus a couple guys like Montgomery and like B-Rob. I think B-Rob is really interesting in this range. But Christian McCaffrey, Kyron Williams, Alvin Kamara, Raheem Mostert, Jonathan Taylor, Joe Mixon, all guys when they were playing were mid to high end running back ones.
Yeah. And the point I was going to make with that is Raheem Mostert, I think, is a guy that is going to get less touchdowns this year, and you're going to see him fall out of this consistency range. I don't think especially with the running back room in Miami, I think that's going to change. But when you're looking at guys like Kyron Williams, I'm not worried about Kyron Williams because that's a situationally based touchdown dependency rate, right? I mean, that's situationally based because you've seen Sean McVay use that Rams offense and use those running backs year over year. And use them until the wheels fall off and they score a ton of touchdowns. It's just that's what he does with his players. And so again, there's quite a few different things you could take away from this, but really in terms of last year was tough because again, things were very, very consistent across the board, and high receiving upside backs have really allowed us to have some pretty high floors among productive running backs. But there are guys that are not on this list that you are going to expect to see in here. For example, Jonathan Taylor, he was not on this list last year because he was not top 24 in points per game. He didn't hit the games threshold for this data, but he should surely be on
snap share threshold for a lot of them. He had a limited snap share.
Yeah. So let's tie this real quick into the current over-unders on Underdog for touchdowns on the year. Chris McCaffrey, 11.5. I mean, you're going to expect him to be one of those.
Is that receiving and rushing combined?
That's rush. This is just rushing.
I was like,
this is just rushing. So over. Yeah. Derrick Henry, again, boomer bust, but he is not a bad pick because he has such a high touchdown line, and he could lead the league. Jonathan Taylor, interestingly enough, is third here with 9.5 over-under is the line, and really with JT. JT showed in 2022 that he can be somewhat inconsistent.
Honestly, the reason it's that low, though, he'd probably be at the top of the list if it weren't for AR.
If it weren't for Anthony Richardson, which I think matters. And then you have Montgomery. Then you have Saquon, Gibbs, Breece. There's that trio of guys that are going like anywhere from the mid-first to mid-second. And all those guys are set at 7.5 touchdowns. And this is just rushing touchdowns. So, again, I think basically what you can use this for is finding regression candidates based on touchdown dependency and based on dud percentage, and also identifying which picks are better in best ball versus which picks are better in redraft. Because again, you don't really want a ton of inconsistency in your redraft leagues. You only have really by week 8, if you're not cruising, you are at a very high likelihood of missing the playoffs at that point. Yep. You can't really afford the 0 weeks from Derrick Henry at that point. So do you have anything else on this one?
No.
Okay. Make sure, like I said, you drop a like on this video. Make sure you subscribe. Let us know what you think. Let us know what you took away from this data, and let us know kind of how you're approaching regression candidates this year from a touchdown standpoint and the running back position. Touchdowns are really important, and you've seen that there's a direct correlation there. You can get our draft guide, which looks like this, in addition to our league projections tool that we've been using a lot now, and our full 2024 fantasy football rankings, which come in the draft guide and are also available on the site when you sign up at flockfantasy.com/domain. Use code domain when you sign up to unlock all 3 of these tools, and make sure you sign up for the Mother Flocker tier. Any Mother Flocker tier subscription gets you all of these tools for the entire season, as long as you're a subscriber. So like I said, flockfantasy.com/domain. Use code domain when you sign up. We appreciate you guys. We'll see you later.